Really an honor and a pleasure to be here with you, partly because this is one of my favorite topics, and partly because of my story coming back to faith. Because I was raised as a Christian, but I went to MIT undergraduate and lost my faith in a few months. And part of the reason for that is I read a book by Richard Dawkins, who I imagine you've heard of, called The Blind Watchmaker, who said everything you see in the world is simply a product of blind chance and time. And what happened is on my journey to faith, there are certain books and authors that were very, very influential. And one you may have heard of, his name is Hugh Ross, and he wrote books like The Creator and the Cosmos. And a lot of those books really helped me to see how there's evidence of design in nature. And that was one of the key points of bringing me back to faith, as well as other authors. So it's really, I've always been an ally and a friend of Reasons to Believe, and have had wonderful conversations with Hugh and Fuzz and many of your other leaders. So what I'll talk about today is one issue that really helped bring me back to faith, and that was the evidence of design in biology. And specifically, I'll be dealing with the origin of life. And I'll be critiquing a lot of the origin of life researchers. And what I don't want to suggest is that these researchers are incompetent or dishonest or ignorant, but simply that they're looking at the world through a certain lens, a certain set of assumptions. And that lens has caused them, as I'll argue, to misinterpret the data. It's also prevented them from seeing the clear evidence of design in biology. And that's what this talk will be about. So I'm going to share my slides. And I'll go through some of the slides very quickly, just for sake of time, just so we end on time. But then we can go through the material in more depth afterwards. But just to get started, what's important to realize is this debate about design and nature is not recent. It goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks, to people like Democritus, who had advocated a philosophy of materialism. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with that term, but when I say materialism or scientific materialism or naturalism, I'm not referring to people that like lots of goods, lots of money, lots of possessions. By materialism, I mean people that believe that everything is a product of chance, time, and natural processes. So when I say materialism or scientific materialism, that's what I'm referring to. The view of people like Richard Dawkins, people like Jerry Coyne, who simply think everything in the universe is the result of physics, chemistry, chance, and time. And of course, they debated people like Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, who advocated design. They believed that the matter that you see in the universe is not sufficient. The laws of nature, what they called the rules of nature, was not sufficient to create the order that you see in life or a planet. They believed a mind was behind it. What happened is the idea of design grew to dominance during the Middle Ages because of the rise of the Christian church. And what happened, though, is that shifted. And it shifted during the scientific revolution, what we call the Enlightenment. And part of it is people realized, like Newton, people like Galileo, people like Kepler, is that so much of the universe could be explained by equations, by simple laws. And that added credence to this materialistic view of the world. Yet, at that time, it didn't really threaten Christian belief or belief in a creator, largely because the people that were the founders of modern science were Christians, and they expected order in the universe because they believed in a God of order. In addition, they recognized that when you look at biology, biology looks something very, very different from a crystal or different from a waterfall. It looks like the product of a designer. One of the most famous people to argue this was William Paley, who was a natural theologian. And he argued that when you look at a watch, you see all these carefully crafted pieces designed to work together for purpose, and you clearly know it's a designer. Well, he said when you look at things like the eye, you see the same thing. You see a lot of different parts carefully crafted to work together for purpose. So design was just assumed in biology, but that changed largely because of Charles Darwin. Now, what's interesting about Charles Darwin is that he presented himself in his biography as an open-minded explorer of the truth. He was just trying to follow the evidence. But when you look at his private journals, you realize that his views were a little bit different than he portrayed. he had been strongly influenced in his college years by free thinkers, people like the Plinian Society, people like Robert Edmund Grant. And what happened is he essentially embraced a materialist view of the world and assumed that life had to be the product of natural processes. So that was sort of the grid that he had even before he started his journey on the Beagle. And he came up with the idea of natural selection. And the idea is very very simple. You have in a population of animals or organisms like mice, variation, differences in traits. Like in this picture, you see some mice are darker, some are lighter. And what happens is these traits are inherited. So you've got variation, you've got inheritance, and you also have what he referred to as natural selection. So for instance, a fox will more easily see these mice that are light colored in a dark background, and they'll eat the white mice. So the dark mice become more and more numerous, and the white mice become less and less common. That's the idea of natural selection. Again, the three pillars of traits that have variation, inheritance, and natural selection. And that's not terribly controversial. It was actually very helpful. It's true. But he extrapolated the very small changes you see in mice or sheep to explain all of life that we see today. So he argues that natural selection acts as a very powerful creative force. What's interesting is he practically memorized William Paley. He loved his writings. And he used the same logic, the same examples, even the same cadence as Paley, but he replaced God with natural selection. So natural selection became a replacement for a creator. And it was a way to remove design from biology. And what happened is the imagery was very powerful. Natural selection and common ancestry and evolution in general offered a powerful way to fit the data. So it excelled partly because of the arguments, but also there were philosophical trends in Europe at the time. There were people that were embracing the materialist tradition from the ancient Greeks. There were skeptics that were arising, questioning belief in a creator. And there's even this recognition that removing design in nature was an instrument of liberation. Like here's a very famous quote. This is from Aldous Huxley. And then Aldous Huxley was the grandson of Thomas Huxley, who was one of Darwin's most vocal advocates. He said, the philosopher who finds no meaning in the world is not concerned exclusively with the problem of pure metaphysics. He is also concerned to prove that there is no valid reason why he personally should not do as he wants to do. For myself, as no doubt for most of my friends, the philosophy of meaninglessness was essentially an instrument of liberation. From a certain system of morality, we objected to the morality because it interfered with our sexual freedom. So what you find is there's both scientific reasons that evolution was promoted and philosophical reasons. But because of the increasing influence of materialist philosophy, that was sort of the tailwind that caused Darwinian evolution to grow from a scientific theory to a sacred creation story. So the Darwinian evolutionary narrative became the creation story of the materialist view of reality of Western civilization that was embraced with sacred devotion. So it's you see it everywhere in Western societies, perhaps in India to some extent, but in cartoons, in TV shows, in books, and education. The Darwinian framework represents the backdrop of reality, much like the Quran would be the backdrop of reality in an Islamic society, or certain Hindu philosophy might be a backdrop of much of Indian culture too. So it's sort of a very similar type perspective. Now, you might be asking yourself, why is this relevant to my talk? Because I'm talking about the origin of life. Doesn't evolution explain what happens after life emerges? That would be a mistake. Because ironically, Darwinian evolution is being seriously questioned by top-level experts in the field, even secular experts. There was a meeting in London by the Royal Society, which is one of the oldest and most prestigious scientific societies in Western society. And they had a meeting called New Trends in Evolutionary Biology. And what they argued was that neo-Darwinism, and that's Darwinism with population genetics and genetics, cannot explain anything significant. It cannot explain large-scale transformations. It cannot explain the sudden appearance of organisms in the fossil record and many other problems like that. Yet, Darwinian evolution is absolutely central to all theories of the origin of life. And I'll flesh that out during my talk. But before I can get into that, I have to give you a little bit more background about origin of life research and the state of the field. Now, the idea that life originated through a natural process is a centerpiece of the secular creation narrative. The idea is that it's not created by God. It's simply a product of physics and chemistry. And to explain that, they've come up with a lot of different theories. And there's a lot of variation of what starts first and how it works. But all the theories at some point have to explain the molecular precursors to the building blocks of life, the molecules that make up life. They have to explain how they got here. And the main molecules are sugars, fatty acids, amino acids, and nucleotides. And amino acids you may be familiar with because they form long chains called proteins, which are the main brick and mortar of the cell. And then nucleotides form things like DNA and RNA. So what happens, the molecular precursors have to be explained, but then you have to explain how they somehow were isolated and concentrated and then linked together in long chains. And I'll primarily focus on proteins and RNA in this lecture. And then that all had to come together inside of a cell membrane. And then eventually you have to have all the biological systems emerge from DNA replication to translation to metabolism. And then eventually you get what we call LUCA, or the last universal common ancestor to all of life. So that's basically the story. Now the question is, how far have they gotten in the story? Well, the first step was strongly supported by an experiment called Miller and Urey. And what they did was they took a lot of the gases that they thought were on the early Earth, they shocked it with electricity, and they were able to produce amino acids and a few other of the basic molecules of life. And this was headline news around the world. It was incredibly exciting that this was seen as a major breakthrough about 75 years ago. Well, everything has been downhill since then, because there's really been no progress made in understanding how life could have originated through a natural process in the origin of life field, despite what you read in the press. Because what happens is you've got to explain four challenges to the origin of life. One is what I call isolation and the linking of molecules and the building blocks, localization, then assembly, and then you've got to deal with the problem of thermodynamics. Now, isolation is actually a very serious problem that is really where every origin of life theory stalls, right here. Because if you look at the Miller-Urey experiment or any other origin of life experiment you care to mention, like the Foremost reaction, and what you find is you always produce tar, asphalt, an incredibly complex mixture of molecules. And yes, you do have a few molecules useful for life, like amino acids, but it's impossible for any natural process on the early Earth to isolate what you need and then concentrate it and then link it together in long chains. Because every amino acid that's in this gunk, there are millions of other molecules that are not useful to life. So an amino acid or a nucleotide is far more likely to link together with a non-useful molecule than with each other. This, again, is where every theory collapses at this point. But let's ignore this problem. Let's just assume that it was easy for amino acids or nucleotides to isolate, concentrate, and then even link together. We'll just assume that's easy. The next problem is the localization, because it turns out that the basic building blocks of life, the proteins, the RNA, the DNA, the cell membrane, have to originate in different locations because they need completely different chemical and physical conditions. So any scenario for the origin of life has to assume that the different building blocks were produced over a very, very large area of land or ocean on the planet. And that's a problem, because if you imagine that you have a protein in just a cubic meter of water, like a small bathtub or a reasonable sized bathtub, and you also have a cell membrane. the time it would take the two to make contact, even in a cubic meter of water, would be like millions of years. So if you're talking about the volumes of water necessary in any scenario, even in the entire history of the universe, you would never see a protein find a cell membrane that would be the staging ground for life. So this is an enormous problem that almost no one talks about. Then there's the assembly problem. Because even if you ignore the first two problems and you put every building block you want for life, you've got your proteins, your DNA, your RNA, whatever you want, you put it inside of a small volume. The problem is there are vast numbers of ways you can link these different building blocks together. In fact, there was a paper by Tompa and Rose, and what they found is the number of arrangements, possible arrangements of proteins in a yeast cell is like 10 to the power of 79 billion. What that means is if you downsize it and say, what would be the smallest cell possible that could be autonomous? Well, still, the probability of arranging the molecules in such a way to have a functional cell would be like the probability of winning the lottery millions of times in a row. Again, the probability of these building blocks, even if they're all there, coming together properly is so small, it could never occur even in a billion universes the size of our universe for trillions of years. Well, there's another problem, because in every example I described, every issue I described, I assumed that once you had a protein or an RNA chain or a building block or cell membrane, you could just keep it there. It would last forever. And then you'd, over time, maybe you would find another building block and come together. The problem is thermodynamics, because what happens is organic materials always decompose into simpler, more disordered molecules. What you never see is simple molecules spontaneously coming together into proteins or RNA or cell membrane. All physical processes move in a direction that is the opposite of what's necessary to bring life together. So even if aliens dropped trillions of tons of molecules like RNA, DNA, even cells that were almost complete, they were 95% complete. They just needed some more proteins or a few other elements. But what happened? They would all immediately start to decompose back into simple molecules, and you'd have to start from scratch. These four problems are enormous. And just to give you an intuitive idea why, I'll just focus on thermodynamics, because I have a PhD in complex systems physics. Nature tends to go from order to disorder, from low entropy to high entropy. If you've got children, you know that you don't have to convince your children to make their room messy. You have to convince them to spend energy to make their room neat. So that's the general trend. Now, less crudely is the idea of microstates, because entropy is just the measure of the probability of some state occurring. So in this example, you've got two spheres with four balls, and there's a lot more ways you can have two balls on one side and two balls on the other than there is to have four balls on one side and none on the other. So the state of equal numbers of balls on each side is much more probable because there's many more ways that it can occur. Therefore, that's a higher entropy state. And to say that nature tends to be higher entropy is simply to state that nature wants to do what's most probable. It's that simple. Almost. There is a situation, though, because the question is, does entropy always spontaneously increase? And the answer is no. Like when water gets very cold, it freezes. But here's why. What happens when water freezes is the oxygen and hydrogen attract each other. So ice represents a lower energy state. And when the molecules come together into this lower energy state, they release heat into the environment. They release energy into the environment. So entropy can decrease if energy decreases and heat is released. And why is that? Because the total entropy still increases. So if you've got a system that goes to lower entropy, like water freezing, it gives off heat, which increases the entropy of the environment. And the extent to which the entropy of the environment goes up is greater than the extent to which the entropy of the system goes down when water freezes. So the total entropy is always greater than zero. The problem is the origin of life requires a system to both decrease in entropy, it's a very ordered state of life, and increase in energy. So it has to absorb energy to create these high energy bonds. And that never occurs spontaneously since the total entropy would decrease, which is a physical impossibility with a spontaneous system. In fact, one of the most prestigious chemists in the world in terms of origin of life is Stephen Benner. And I believe he's an atheist or agnostic. So he assumes that life must have originated through a natural process. But he says chemical theories, including the second law of thermodynamics, suggest that it is impossible for any non-living chemical system to escape devolution and to enter into the Darwinian world of the living. So even though he assumes that life must have originated through natural processes, he has the intellectual honesty to say that everything we know about chemistry and physics, every origin of life research experiment ever done suggests that the origin of life appears impossible. That is very significant. So here's just a quick summary of the problem. To get a cell, you've got to take molecules on the early Earth. You have to build them into the building blocks. You then have to transport them to the right area, assemble them properly, and this all requires you to harness energy from the environment. Well, every step towards life would represent an extremely rare event. Yes, occasionally two amino acids could come together. Occasionally, a thermodynamic fluctuation might help you towards life. But for every step towards life, there would be countless steps away from life because natural processes all go in the opposite direction. Well, that gets into a very interesting question. Why is it that we see so many headlines about how there's been so much progress in the origin of life? Like, here's a great example. Unraveling life's origin, 5 key breakthroughs over the past 5 years. Well, what you find is if you look at all of these articles, they're all exaggerations. Because when you go to the original research, what you find is every step towards life only occurred because very, very clever chemists set up very clever experiments to force molecules in the direction of life. They start with the perfect conditions. High concentrations and purities of the right molecules. They have a very carefully orchestrated protocol that moves the molecules gradually in the direction they want. So these experiments have no relevance to what could have occurred on the early Earth because the early Earth didn't have lots of fancy laboratory equipment and highly talented organic chemists. In fact, there is an organic chemist named James Tour. He's considered one of the top organic synthetic chemists in the world. He creates molecular machines. Like, this is a molecular submarine he created. And these machines can actually bind to cells and then burrow into the cells and kill the cells. So his research could literally transform medicine from the ground up. These machines could cure cancer. They could kill bacteria. They could kill COVID. Quite amazing. And he recognized that to create these molecular machines is very, very, very difficult. He has to have incredibly complex protocols. And he realizes the molecules in life are even more complex and harder to create. So he said, look, and he looked through all the origin of life research he could find and realized that every claim that origin of life researchers have moved towards life only took place because of enormous amounts of intervention. What he did is he actually, I'll skip his audio for sake of time. Yeah, if in the question and answer, I could show it to you. It's very entertaining. But what he did was he challenged the top origin of life researchers in the world and said, can you show me that you've made any progress in the basic questions of starting towards life? Because he put up a series of videos about the difficulty of the problem. He got lots of pushback. And he said, look, if you don't like what I'm saying, show me that I'm wrong. So he challenged these origin of life researchers to demonstrate that they've made progress. None responded. Then Harvard University said, let's have a debate. We will fly any one of you over that would like to, and then James Tour and you can talk about it. and you can really bring clarity to this issue. Only one researcher accepted the invitation to go to Harvard to debate James Tour. His name was Lee Cronin. Lee Cronin, during his lecture, talked about his theory called assembly theory. And assembly theory is a theory that's really gotten a lot of press. Here's a great example. Assembly theory puts chemistry center stage to explain molecular complexity and life's origins. Assembly theory, bold new theory of everything, could unite physics and evolution. What's clear is Lee Cronin is really, really good with the press. He is a master of public relations. Well, as it turns out, though, assembly theory does not in any way explain any step towards the origin of life. It ignores all the chemistry. And what was really fascinating is during the debate, James Tour said, I predict Lee Cronin won't even talk about the chemistry, and James Tour is right. And what happened was there was actually a computational biologist. His name is Hector Zanil. He went on the podcast with James Tour, and he explained that assembly theory doesn't explain anything about the origin of life, that it's really just very similar to previous compression algorithms that people developed decades ago. But what's really fascinating is if you look at assembly theory, what it really is a method of design detection. In fact, the logic of assembly theory is very, very similar to the work by people like George Montañez, Bill Dembski, Winston Ewart, and all assembly theory is a method to detect design. And what assembly theory does is it says if you find something highly improbable, like a molecule with lots of parts, and it's somehow special, and specifically it has lots of copies of itself, then that suggests that it's life. But what they're doing is they're not saying it's design, although it's special, they're saying that natural selection designed it. And this is what I'm talking about, is what happens in origin of life research is they simply overlook the challenges because they appeal to two forces that they believe have limitless creative power. One is self-organization, and the second is natural selection. So these are sort of the powers behind every origin of life research. And these powers are supposed to overcome every problem that I talked about. Unfortunately, they don't, for reasons I'm going to now explain. Now, self-organization is simply a process where you've got a system and you have energy or material entering and leaving the system. And that flow of energy or that flow of matter and energy create patterns that emerge, self-organizational patterns. Like if you boil spaghetti, you may have noticed those roll patterns that appear in your spaghetti. Or a classic example would be a tornado. And what happens is self-organization takes place because you have an energy source like the sun. And the energy source is properly matched to a system to create a pattern. So in the case of a tornado, the energy from the sun heats the air. The hot air then will drive the velocity of the air to increase, and that causes the tornado funnel cloud. So what happens is the energy directly drives air, which creates self-organizational behavior. The problem is, when you look at life, all of the early energy sources on the early Earth, like heat, radiation, UV light, break apart the building blocks of life. Raw energy destroys life. Raw energy will not create life. Now, to illustrate the problem and how life actually works, I need to use an analogy. Let's imagine a person heard that energy, raw energy, creates order, like a tornado. And this is what origin of life people claim all the time, that the flow of energy in a system will create the order of life. So this person thinks that's amazing. When they go home to their house and they find their house is a complete mess. Maybe their spouse or their children just messed up the place because they had a wild party. And the person remembers energy creates order. That's amazing. So they decide to set their couch on fire, and then they got lots of energy. The problem is raw energy creates disorder. That's the big problem. Because the way energy is used in cells is you have very complex molecular machines. This is a picture of ATP synthase. And what happens is, in this case, the flow of protons through the cell membrane causes a rotor to rotate, and the rotation of the rotor causes other proteins to change their conformation. And that motion pushes two molecules together, what's technically called ATDP and P, or phosphorus and adenosine diphosphate. And that physical motion pushes the molecules together and creates ATP, and ATP is the energy source for life. So this machine is essentially harnessing the flow of protons, like electrical current, turn it into mechanical motion. Then the mechanical motion creates chemical energy, and the chemical energy is what is useful for life. Then there's other molecules besides ATP also. So to have order, you can't have raw energy. You have to have a machine that converts one form of energy that's available in nature into a second form of energy useful for life. Now let's go back to our analogy. Let's imagine that our hypothetical patron of a household realizes that raw energy isn't helpful. So they buy a robot, and that robot has an engine, and the engine converts one form of energy into another. Perhaps it converts gasoline into mechanical motion or solar power or whatever. So they charge up the robot and then they let it loose. Is that good? No, because the robot will much more likely destroy the house than to organize it. What is missing? What is missing is information. The robot needs instructions to tell it how to use its mechanical energy, its motion, to order the house according to a blueprint for the house. You have to have a blueprint, a schematic, a plan, and you have to have information of how to build what you want to build. The same thing is true in cells. This is just the metabolic map. Every line on this map corresponds to some sort of chemical reaction or a physical process. And what happens is every single step requires an enzyme. An enzyme is a protein, and the protein is folded into a three-dimensional shape, which will drive the reaction or the process that's needed. And as I mentioned before, proteins are long chains of amino acids, and there's 20 amino acids. In the same way, there's 26 letters in the English alphabet. And the amino acids have to be arranged in the right order. In the same way, you have to arrange letters in a sentence in the right way to convey a message. So if it has the right order, it folds into the right structure and performs the task that's needed. In addition, in cells, you've got information in DNA that act like an operating system. The information in DNA determine when processes happen and to what extent they happen and when they shut off. So the information in DNA is also essential to run the operations of a cell. So the information in life, DNA and proteins, is comparable to the information in the computer program that told the robot how to order your house. So information is essential to direct energy properly, to do what you need to do to both build a cell and to manage every system in a cell. That's key. And the challenge is that these proteins are incredibly hard to occur by chance. To have life, you've got to have proteins in the same way the robot needed instructions. Here is a list of how likely it is for a random amino acid sequence to form a functional protein. And for most of these proteins, what happens is the chance of a random amino acid sequence forming that protein is much less than one chance in 10 to the power of 40. That's a 1 with 40 zeros. So even if you look at life, there is only 10 to the 40 organisms that could have existed on the entire history of our planet. So none of these proteins could have emerged through a blind, undirected process. The information had to be supplied externally. And even many of the ones that in principle could appear randomly are so rare they in practice probably couldn't. A couple on this list aren't even real proteins. They're just chains that stick to things. So there are a small number of proteins that could have formed by chance in life today, but they're very simple and do very simple things. Most proteins are so rare they could only have emerged from a mind putting the amino acids together in the right way. And this is true even more on the early Earth. Because remember, it is next to impossible for a random sequence of amino acids to form that's even a few dozen amino acids long. It's incredibly improbable because the amino acids will almost certainly connect with other molecules before each other. So you're probably not going to have even one protein. But even if aliens dropped tons of proteins on the early Earth with random sequence or tons of randomly sequenced amino acids, there is no chance that even one could do a complex task like a polymerase or a topoisomerase, or any complex machinery in cells would require proteins that are so rare they couldn't happen by chance. That's a huge issue. In fact, what's really amazing is some of these problems have been acknowledged. Like here's a great paper called Frankenstein or Submarine Alkaline Vent, who is responsible for abiogenesis, the origin of life. And this paper acknowledges that we claim in particular that it is untenable to hold that life-relevant biochemistry could have emerged in the chemical chaos produced by mass action chemistry and chemically non-specific energy inputs, and only later having evolved its dauntingly specific mechanisms as a part of evolving all the rest of life's features. So they argue what I'm saying. They talk about how every single process, every reaction in the origin of life or in a cell occurs because of a machine. They even go so far as to say that the processes must conform to an elaborate organizational design. They even use that language. So what do they believe? Do they recognize that life is designed? Because they know it couldn't have happened through a natural process. They realize it appears to be conformed to an organizational design. No, here's what they do. They say, instead, we claim it had to have been launched simple and specific, and thereafter have been forced by the scythe of natural selection to maintain the necessary specificity standard at each evolutionary increment in complexity. More specifically, all the devices of life, metabolic and structural, must have been invented by it, that's natural selection, in situ, step by step, and while in flight, starting from the simplest possible inputs. And learning itself by trial and error. Let me just read that again. And learning itself by trial and error, which small changes themselves occurring by chance were useful. Each incremental step in this evolution by creeps, complexity building process necessarily being vetted by the system, both for fitting in and for contributing more utility than cost. So again, what they're doing is they're saying that natural selection is the agent that puts everything together properly. Well, there's a problem. In their scenario, you have a lot of chemicals in a vent, like a thermal vent. There's nothing reproducing. So if nothing is reproducing, there is no natural selection. So they're appealing to natural selection not as a real process, but more as a secular demigod, as an intelligent agent, a fictitious demigod that has creative power. It's really quite remarkable. Now, there are people that have tried to argue that molecules could go through natural selection, and that would be like the RNA world hypothesis. The idea is that you've got these little nucleotides, they form into long chains. Some of those chains happen to have the right sequence so that they would fold into a structure, kind of like this, and that structure would copy other chains. So these RNAs called polymerases or replicases would copy other RNAs. So then you've got variation, you've got inheritance and natural selection. And the idea is that these RNAs would be selected to perform useful cellular tasks. The problem is that this is completely implausible. As I mentioned, you will never get an RNA long enough to do anything significant. Nucleotides are incredibly complex molecules. Any produced on the early Earth would have been very small concentrations surrounded by many other molecules. So they absolutely could not have come together in long chains. But even if they did, the probability that they would have the right sequence to copy other RNAs is virtually zero. But even if they could, here's the problem, is the problem of thermodynamics, because I talked a bit about the isolation, localization problem, the information problem, but the thermodynamics problem is actually the worst, because RNAs quickly break apart. So for a system to be self-replicating, you would need millions of copies of these long RNAs in a milliliter of water, like a thimble worth of water, which is fantastically implausible. Because if you didn't have that number, the RNAs would break apart more quickly than they could be replicated. So there was no natural selection on the early Earth. So what happens is natural selection and self-organization are appealed to not as real processes, but as secular demigods. And for sake of time, I will skip the quote. And finally, I want to mention that not only is the origin of life impossible through natural processes, but it demonstrates clear evidence of design, because information, at least large quantities of information, point to a mind. If you see a message in alphabet soup, and alphabet soup is a fun dish we have in the United States. I hope you have in India, where you have the soup with letters that are pasta. If you saw the letters in your soup coming together to say, drink plenty of fluids and rest until you're feeling better, you would know you couldn't explain that information by the chemistry of the pasta or the physics of the boiling water, because information is only the product of a mind. And the amount of information you would need, even in the simplest cell, would be like the story A Christmas Carol. It'd be millions of bits of information. Now, I've actually done a project with engineers and biologists, and what we're doing is we're comparing studies of minimally complex cells. How simple can cells actually exist? There's lots of ways they go about that, with studies of minimally complex self-replicating machines, like NASA's attempt to create a self-replicating space probe, or the research of von Neumann, or attempts to create self-replicating robots. And what you find is self-replication by its nature requires certain functions that you always see in the list of a minimally complex cell. Things like energy production, selective gateways, active transport, information processing, manufacturing, auto assembly, automated repair, waste disposal, recycling, sensors, signal processing, and control systems. This represents positive evidence for design that is so clear and so unambiguous. To deny it, you have to actively suppress the truth. Thank you.